So today we're going to talk about the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to specifically look at narrative criticism. So we want to use Mark chapter 2, verse 1 to 3, 6, not only to look at the passage today in our study of Mark itself, but we also want to see how narrative criticism help us to understand Mark chapter 2, verse 1 to 3, 6. So I believe you still remember that in the second session last week, that I did mention about the genre of the Bible, the different literary styles of the Bible. And as you can see here, that there's about half of the Bible are in the narrative format. So it's 43%, which is a very large percentage of the Bible is in the narrative format or literary style. And that's why it's important to know how to read a narrative. And that's where I believe narrative criticism or narrative analysis will help us to have a better grasp of our understanding of the Gospel of Mark. But before narrative criticism became popular for biblical studies, there are other three criticisms that were used in biblical studies in the past. One of them is source criticism, followed by form criticism, and then reduction criticism. Source criticism is the quest for the earliest sources which lie behind a given biblical text, which means that what they are trying to do is to find the source for the written text itself. So they will search for the source and to see how this and the written text relate to each other in the history of transmission. For example, we talked about the semiotic problems. So that's one area of source criticism where we try to identify which is the earliest gospel and which gospel is actually the source for the other gospels that were written. Right? So if you remember in the synoptic gospels, there are two ideas there, either the two document hypothesis or the four document hypothesis, right? So there's also the idea, or rather the argument whether it's Markan priority or Matthean priority. So it is actually a discussion of which is the earliest gospel and which gospel is actually the source for the other gospels that will be written. So this is source criticism. Then we have form criticism. Form criticism is to kind of like focus on the original form of the different narratives that we see in the Gospels. So the focus is on the period oral tradition and sees the Bible as a collection of traditional stories and sayings that were spread from word of mouth and eventually preserved in writing. So from oral tradition to the written form itself. What was the form before it was written as is being passed on through oral performance and oral tradition itself. So it tries to classify the different section or different small section of the gospel into different forms, right? Whether it's poems or it's a miracle narratives or it's a controversy narrative. So what they are trying to do is to go down and to find the smallest unit and to decide what does this small unit belongs to which form. Right. So this is form criticism, and the aim is to determine the original form and the relationship of the life and thought of the period to the development of the literary tradition. Right. So find out what is the form and how does that form relate to the life during that time. Okay, for example, if the oral tradition, how does the oral tradition relates to the people during that time? So this is what form criticism seeks to do. So in form criticism, every stories or every part of the Bible can be classified into different forms. I can see here that there are different forms that's being proposed by different scholars, right? So this is how they try to group the different texts in the written gospels into its different forms, from the oral tradition until it is being written. The third one is reduction criticism. Reduction criticism is something like editing a text itself, how you put the different stories together, what are the things that's being changed when it's taken from one text to another text, right? And why the author decides to change that wording, or to change the order of the story itself. So this all falls under reduction criticism. So there are two basic types of analysis for reduction criticism. You have the emendation and the composition analysis. Emendation analysis talks about the author's way of changing words from the source text itself. For example, you can see here between Mark and Matthew, the words has been changed as Matthew adapt, or as Matthew uses Mark's source. He changes, or he mandated the source itself. So the wordings has been changed, right? So this is emendation analysis. Then of course you have composition analysis. Composition analysis has to do with how the author kind of put things together, right? So just like when you write composition itself, how you write it, what are the different ways of putting the stories together. So that's about the composition analysis. And you can example here is in Matthew 18, where you see that Matthew tries to kind of soften or pillow the harshness of the expulsion of the Christian brothers mentioned in chapter 18, verse 15 to 20, with two parables or two stories about the kindness of God and the love of God itself, to soften the harshness that is being mentioned in chapter 18, 15 to 20. So this is composition analysis, how the author manage or put things together in his writing. Then with that, we have narrative criticism. It's a type of criticism that focuses on the literary shape of the text. That means you look at the text and from the text itself, try to find what is the text trying to say, and how does the text brings out its message itself, right? So it examine the text to discern its aspect, its genre, structure, characters in the stories, and the different point of views that's been presented in the story itself. There are several narrative elements that you have to look at as you do narrative criticism. So you have the implied author, implied reader, the characters, the settings, the plot, and rhetoric devices. So let's look at the first one, implied author, implied reader. The implied author is not the real author of the work, but is the author that the real author wants the reader to encounter. So it's kind of like a imagined self, right? An imagined self that the real author wants the reader to encounter in his reading. And as the author is writing, he or she will have a certain group of people that he or she has in mind that he or she wants to write the text for, and that's called the implied reader, which is very different or different from the actual readers, right? The actual readers can be anyone, but when the authors write his text, he has a specific audience in mind, and that's the implied reader that we are talking about. So the implied reader and the implied author are all part of the text itself, right? It's within the text itself, while the real author and the real reader are external to the text. So as you read every gospel, who do you actually encounter is not the real author in that sense, but the implied author, the projection of the image of the author that the real author wants to you to encounter, right? So that's the implied author and implied reader. And then of course, in any narratives, there must be character, right? So as I mentioned before, the character are known by their acts and by their words. The author usually don't tell us a lot about the characters, how they look like, or even their psychological makeup, and sometimes even their thoughts. We are not told about them. So It is through their acts and their words. And of course, sometimes we do see the narrator of the text give us a glimpse into the character itself, right? But not very often. Characters are two types. They are either the flat or the round type. The flat type characters remains the same throughout the whole narratives. They don't change, they don't develop. They are stereotyped. Right, so that's the flat. If they are good in the beginning, they will be good until the end. If they're evil in the beginning, they will be evil until the end. So you see a kind of very flat portrayal of the character in the narrative text. Whereas the round characters are those that developed, right? Those that are more multi-perspective, where you can see the characters from different angles. They show different kinds of side of the characters as a real person. So that is the round character. So I'd like you to watch this clip that help to explain character in a narrative.
We're talking about how to read biblical narrative, or in other words, how to read stories.
Right. And one of the main ingredients of any good story is characters who encounter conflict and then have to overcome it.
Yeah, let's talk about characters. In most stories, we quickly identify with characters because, just like them, we're in our own story having our own conflicts that we need to overcome.
Yeah, and good stories have characters with relatable struggles. We can watch them react to these challenges in different ways, and we get to see what happens as a result. Through characters, an author can show us their view of what it means to be human. The Bible's no different. Biblical stories use characters as a mirror so we can see ourselves and discover our own human nature in the reflection.
The thing about characters in the Bible is that they can be hard to relate to. I mean, often there's very little detail given about them.
Yeah, biblical authors develop characters differently than modern narratives. They prefer to communicate a lot through minimal detail. For example, we rarely hear what people look like in the Bible, but when we do, it's crucially important for the story.
Like we're told that Saul is tall and David was kind of a runt.
And these become images of their moral character. Saul's height matches his love of status and power to impose authority, while David humbly accepts his low status and allows God to exalt and deliver him.
So people's physical appearances are symbolic.
Yeah, very often. Like Esau's hairy body fits his animal-like behavior, and Jacob's smooth skin matches his deceptive, slippery nature.
What other clues do we get about biblical characters?
Well, often people's names symbolize their role in the story. Abraham in Hebrew sounds like father of a multitude. Jacob means deceiver. Ruth means refreshment. And Saul, his name means the one asked for. He's the flawed king that the people requested.
So by packing all this meaning with very little detail, biblical stories can do a lot in a little space.
And they even leave out things that modern readers want to know about these characters. Like they rarely come out and tell us people's thoughts or motives.
Right, like when Moses saw an Egyptian beating an Israelite, he kills him on the spot. But why? Was this righteous anger, or did he just lose his cool? And was it okay with God that he did it?
Yeah, we're not told. Because biblical authors usually avoid giving moral commentary. They would rather have a character's words and actions reveal their motives, and then leave us to judge their behavior by seeing the consequences. So in the case of Moses, this murders the beginning of a pattern of his anger getting the best of him with bad results. This choice forces him to run and hide in the desert for 40 years.
So it was a bad thing. But he does meet his wife out there, so it's a good thing?
Exactly. It forces you to ponder. Through all these techniques, the biblical narrators keep their stories compact, memorable, but also engaging.
But seriously, was Moses being good or bad? Right? Like in classic stories, there's always a good guy and a bad guy, some admirable hero who faces off against some horrible villain.
Sure, and simplified characters like that are helpful for teaching children there's such a thing as good and evil. But the Bible's not a children's book. Its characters are very complex, a mixed bag of good and evil, just like us. There's hardly any flawless characters in the Bible.
What about heroes of the faith like Abraham or King David?
So you mean Abraham, who used an Egyptian slave for sex and then lied about his wife 2 times to save his own neck? And David, the man after God's own heart, who sleeps with another man's wife and then murders him? These stories are anything but simplistic. They offer us realistic portraits of compromised people like ourselves. The real surprise is that God keeps working with them despite their failures.
So, just because a person's called by God or wins a battle, becomes successful or wealthy, doesn't mean the biblical author wants me to act like them.
Right. It would actually be really dangerous to imitate most biblical characters.
True. But there must be something admirable in biblical characters, something I can imitate.
Absolutely. Pay attention, and you'll notice that most biblical stories highlight the moments when characters fail or come to the end of themselves, and then they choose radical trust in God's grace and wisdom. It's in these stories that the authors show us how to be a human who truly pleases God through humility and surrender.
Yeah, the fact that God stays committed to biblical characters is a profound statement about the patience and love of God, who is also a character.
Right. And by studying biblical characters, we can observe our own worst tendencies on display. And we see time and again God's gracious response that will see this story through to the end.
So that's the biblical character and introduction.
We're talking about how
characters, and you see how important characters play in the entire narrative itself. So as you read the Bible, as you read the Gospel of Mark, do pay attention to the characters that are in the story itself, right? Pay attention to them. What did they say and what did they do? The next thing about narratives is the settings. In this case, where and when, because every setting give us or set us up for certain kind of expectation. For example, if the setting is a house, there will be certain kind of expectation that you would have about the house itself. And of course, when it is if the setting is in a hospital, for example, then you have a different kind of expectation from the setting. And the time, right? When did it take place? Is it in the morning, evening? Is it on a Sabbath or just on any other day? So this is also important for us to take note, the where and the when of the narratives, right? So the settings of the narrative itself is important. So I'd like you to watch the next video that explains settings.
In every story you've ever heard, the action took place somewhere, and that place is called the setting. And since we've been learning how to read biblical narratives, let's talk about how settings work in the Bible.
So, settings are a crucially important tool in the hands of the biblical authors.
Really?
Yeah, think of it this way. When you start a story, everything is new. The plot and the characters are a mystery until things unfold.
Yeah, we have no idea what to expect.
Except, authors can use the setting of a story to prepare you for what's coming.
How so?
Well, let's say a story begins in a courtroom. What do you think is going to happen?
I expect a story about crime and justice.
Yeah, or how about the setting of a dark, old, rundown house?
Oh, something scary is about to happen.
Exactly. So settings evoke memories and emotions because of other stories you know that happened in similar places. The authors know this, and they can use settings to generate expectations about what could happen in this story. And a good author will get creative with settings, and he'll mess with your expectations in order to make a point.
This happens in the Bible?
All over the place. For example, think about the setting Egypt in the Bible.
Yeah, big Middle Eastern empire on the Nile.
Sure. Now think about the first biblical story where someone ends up in Egypt. It's about Abraham. God calls him to journey by faith to a new land, and he promises to give him a huge family. So he sets out, but he arrives during a famine. Now, is he going to trust God and stay in the promised land? Or will he leave the land and go look for food on his own?
Yeah, Abraham leaves and goes down to Egypt.
And there, in Egypt, things go downhill fast. Abraham denies that Sarah is his wife to save his own neck, and then Pharaoh tries to marry her for himself.
Okay, first impression of Egypt, not a great place to visit.
But God then rescues them. He strikes Egypt with plagues, and so Pharaoh relents and sends Abraham away with loads of wealth. So, what do we learn about Egypt as a setting from this story?
It's the place people end up because of stupid decisions, but it's also a place where God comes and rescues his people.
Yep, and the next main story in Egypt follows the same pattern. Abraham's great-grandsons make a bunch of stupid choices, and they eventually lead them to Egypt because of another famine.
Down in Egypt, uh-oh.
So generations pass, and the family ends up as slaves in Egypt, and what do you think's going to happen?
God's gonna send some plagues and rescue his people.
It's like you saw it coming. After the Israelites get back to the Promised Land, God tells them to never go back to Egypt for any reason. It's the place of trouble and oppression.
So when future biblical characters go to Egypt, I'm supposed to cringe.
Right. Like Solomon, at the peak of his wealth and power, he married the king of Egypt's daughter, and then he started sending Israelites there to import Egyptian stallions. And then, a generation later, that alliance goes bad. Egypt oppresses Israel all over again.
So biblical settings carry with them all these memories of previous stories, which create expectation.
Yeah, it's a brilliant literary device to infuse stories with meaning. Now, biblical authors, they're brilliant. They can build up your expectations, but also creatively mess with them.
Like how?
Egypt's a perfect example. In the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus is born, his family flees to Egypt.
Uh-oh, so this is a problem.
You would think so, but pay attention. Instead of Egypt being the bad place, it's the place of safety. Because who are they fleeing from? King Herod, who is behaving exactly like Pharaoh did, but he rules Jerusalem, not Egypt.
Matthew is messing with me to show how Jerusalem has become Egypt.
Exactly. You can find these kinds of patterns in many different biblical settings. Babylon, Moab, the wilderness, Bethlehem, the list goes on.
Which is a big list.
And it gets bigger, because sometimes the setting isn't just a place on a map. It's a type of situation, but they work the same way that settings do. For example, when people move toward the east, expect trouble. Adam and Eve were banished to the east, and then Cain wanders to the east.
People move to the east to build Babylon.
And all of these narratives are designed to point forward to when the Israelites as a people will be exiled to the east in Babylon.
Ah, nice.
Which leads to one more type of setting in biblical narrative, and that's time, or how long events take. Like, time periods of 40 are often associated with stories where people's faithfulness is tested. Noah in the boat for 40 days and 40 nights. Then he gets off and gets totally drunk. The Israelites got impatient during their 40 days of waiting for Moses on Mount Sinai, so they made the golden calf. Or after the Israelite spies investigate the land for 40 days, the people rebel, so they have to wander in the desert for 40 years.
But then there's the story of Jesus, who was tested in the desert for 40 days, and he reverses the expectation. He overcomes the test.
Exactly. Across the whole Bible, places, situations, and time periods become full of meaning by evoking memories and setting expectations. And the New Testament authors reuse all of these settings to show how Jesus is the one carrying our world from the garden, out of Egypt and the wilderness, and into the new creation.
In every story you've ever heard.
So that's the settings, right? So you see how interesting the settings can be in biblical narratives. That's why you need to pay attention to the settings as you read the gospel itself. So just like how Egypt in the settings has implications for the rest of the biblical stories, you need also to see how the settings in one episode might have connection to the other episode. So something for us to keep in mind as we read the gospel itself, right? The setting itself. The third thing, of course, is the plot. The plot is what happened in the story and why does it happen. So every narrative is actually has a plotted time. So events developed in the plot in the time itself. And narrative world is comprised of all events described or referred to in the narrative. Sometimes it might not be in the story itself, but it's being referred to, a kind of a intertextual or allusion to other events, and they are always in a kind of a causal or logical sequence, right? So the different stories kind of lead up to the next story itself, and that's how the plot is being developed. Just like you watch a movie, right? Every scene is connected to the next scene, whether it's a playback or is a foreshadow, but they have a kind of a causal and logical sequence within the narrative plot line itself. Plotting of this narrative world is to be seen in the way its components have been selected and arranged in a sequence of narrated incidents, right? So once again, how the different episodes are being put together, that is how the author tries to lay out the plot and build the plot, the climax of the plot. So as you read the gospel itself, you need to see how the plot is developed within each individual episode and as a gospel as a whole, right? So do pay attention to the plot and just watch this clip on explanation on plot.
We're learning how to read different types of literature in the Bible, and we're going to start by talking about biblical narrative.
So, narratives, in their most basic form, have characters in a setting going through a series of events. And how those events are selected and then arranged by an author, that's called the plot.
A basic plot line begins with a character in her setting. But then something new or unexpected happens, causing problems that lead up to some ultimate conflict, which is then resolved and the character finds herself changed, living in a new normal.
Now, in reading narratives, it's important to understand every scene in the context of its larger plot line. You can make the same story have a totally different message if you ignore where it occurs in the plot. This happens all the time when people read the Bible.
Really?
Yeah, take for example the story about Gideon. There's this well-known scene where Gideon's trying to discern whether God will help him win a battle, and he requests a sign from God.
Yeah, Gideon lays a wool fleece on the ground and asks that in the morning the fleece be wet with dew, but the ground totally dry, and God does it.
Now, if you look at this scene just by itself, what is the conflict?
How can Gideon know if he'll succeed?
And the resolution?
Test God, ask for a sign, and find out.
Yeah, and that's how many people actually read this story, and it totally misses the point, because it's ignoring the larger plot line.
Really?
Yeah, so let's start from the beginning, you'll get the context. The story begins with Gideon and the Israelites living in fear because they're oppressed by an invading people, the Midianites.
Got it.
Then there's the call to action. God commissions Gideon to defeat the Midianites and save Israel.
Yeah, this is shaping up to be a good story.
But then Gideon's super hesitant, so he asks God to do this magic trick, a sign, so I can know it's really you talking to me. And God stoops to his level. He gives him a sign by lighting this fire on an altar.
So Gideon's already asked for a sign.
And that's not all. In the next scene, God tells Gideon to tear down an altar to another god, but Gideon's so afraid, he does it at night.
So Gideon's skeptical and also a bit of a coward.
Then we come to the moment where Gideon's about to face the Midianites, and he's still uncertain, so he asks for another sign, the fleece. He says, I want to know if you'll save Israel by my hand.
And God gives him that sign.
And he's still uncertain, so he asks for even one more sign, which is just a variation of the previous sign.
Okay, so Gideon's asking for way too many signs.
Exactly. In the larger context, it's clear the plot conflict is not how can Gideon discern the mysterious will of God. The real conflict is when will this guy get his act together and start trusting God?
Okay, so then what's the resolution?
We have to keep reading. So Gideon gathers this huge army, 30,000 soldiers to fight the Midianites, and God says, no, way too many men. He whittles the army down to 300.
Why would he do that?
Well, Gideon's been testing God, so now God returns the favor. He tells Gideon to arm these 300 soldiers with trumpets and torches, and then surround the Midianites at night and make all this noise in the hills, which sounds ridiculous, but Gideon does it. And the noise scares the Midianites into this frenzy. They start destroying each other in the dark while Gideon looks on safely from the hills.
So this story isn't offering the reader tips for discerning God's will.
No, it's about God's commitment to use weak people with deep flaws to do more than they could have imagined.
Okay, So short scenes, like Gideon and the fleece, are combined with other scenes making up a larger plot line. And tracing the conflict and resolution through the plot helps you see the message the author's trying to get across.
Now, Gideon's story has been set alongside many other stories that are also about these flawed, often questionable leaders called judges. And each of these has its own internal plot line. But then altogether they make up a whole movement of the biblical story, the period of the judges, and that has its own unified plot line.
And there are many movements within the story of the Bible.
Exactly. And all the smaller stories, hundreds of them, they fit within the context of their own movements. And then these movements together make up the building blocks of the grand plot line of the whole story of the Bible.
So no matter where I'm reading in the Bible, I need to pay attention to these different layers of plot so I can read each story in context.
Exactly. The Bible is such a sophisticated piece of literature. And so all these smaller plot lines keep overlapping, building up the tension. And when you back up, you can see how they've all been woven together into the unified story that leads to Jesus.
So that's on the plot. As you have seen, it is important to read every episode to know only within itself, but its connection to the wider story, right? For example, Gideon, the example is given in the video itself. To read that small portion by itself will give us very wrong understanding of the episode itself, as if we are to test God in order to find out His will. Well, if you look at it in the whole story of Gideon, you know that the whole point is to highlight the doubt, the cowardice of Gideon himself. Even though God has given him so many signs, he still keep asking God for signs. So as you read the different stories, the different episodes in the gospel itself, you must also keep in mind how does that particular passage or that particular episode relates to the entire gospel, right? So that must be kept in mind. The next is rhetoric or stylistic features that we will need to look at when we do narrative analysis, right? So basically, this is how the author brings across the message, what kind of literary devices that he used to convey his message. So there are a few rhetorical devices that's being used in Mark. There's intercalation, or more commonly known as Markan sandwich, with foreshadowing, echoing, symbolism, and irony. So intercalation, a Markan sandwich, is about sandwiching one story in another story. Right, so it forms kind of A1, B, A2 pattern. So A1 and A2 will be of the same story, while B will be a different story that's being put in between a story A. And both has to be read together because that's how Mark, the device that Mark used to bring out his message. An example that you can see here is in chapter 2, verse 1 to 12, where you have the story of the paralytic that's been brought to Jesus. And within the story of the paralytic, you have another story where Jesus has an encounter with the scribes. So in a sense, there are two stories there. There's this healing narratives. At the same time, there's also the conflict narratives. And Mark kinds of put these two stories together by sandwiching B in between A1 and A2. The other examples that I can think of in Mark is the cursing of the fig tree, where you will see that the cursing of the fig tree is intercalated in between Jesus's visit to the temple itself. So that's the Markan sandwich, which is very common in Mark, and you need to pay close attention to that. Foreshadowing is another device that Mark uses in his gospel. It is where the writer gives an advanced knowledge of what's going to happen later in the story. For example, in 1:8, where John the Baptist came and said that Jesus will baptize with Holy Spirit. So it's a kind of a foreshadowing, giving us a sign, a hint, a taste of what's going to happen, a glimpse into something that will happen in the future. And there are other examples that you can check it out on your own. The third device is echoes. Echoes can be intratextual or intertextual. If it's intratextual, then it's a kind of alluding the different parts of the writings itself, right, within that same writing. So for example, Mark 1:7 alluded or was echoed in 1:21 to 28, right, where John the Baptist tells us that there's someone who is stronger, more powerful than he, that will come after him. And we do see that kind of a foreshadowing where we see the actual thing in a sense in chapter 1, verse 21 and 28. So the other examples, you can check it out on yourself. In the textual echoes, Mark uses, or Mark echoes the Old Testament. Mark 1, 2, and 3 echoes Malachi 3, 1 and Isaiah 4, 3. So these are kind of the stylistic features that we see in Mark as well, or the other Gospels, where it actually echoes the Old Testament. And we must then look into why the author echoes those passages in his writing. The next is symbolism, right? Symbolism is to place side by side a literal meaning and a metaphorical meaning. For example, the number 12. Literal meanings means 12, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. But there's a metaphorical meaning to the number 12. It represents the nation of Israel with 12 tribes. So when Jesus called the 12 disciples, is there a hint that the number 12 is actually symbolic, a reconstitution of a new Israel? Jesus healed the woman who suffered the issue of blood for 12 years and healed the girl 12 years old. Is there a symbolic meaning behind the number 12 in those two stories itself? Geography can also be symbolic. For example, the desert. The desert is a symbolic of the testing of the Israel in the wilderness. That's where they encounter God. Similarly, when Jesus, after his baptism, was being led into the wilderness, he was being tested there. And we see that there's a kind of a symbolic meaning for desert, right? So one of the tasks that I'd like you to do is to find the symbolism in Mark's Gospels, right? So what symbolism or what symbols that Mark used in his Gospels, right? So this is one assessment or one exercise that I'd like you to do as part of the fulfillment of this video learning session. So identify the different symbolic use of geography, numbers, other symbols, right, in the Gospel of Mark, and note them down. Irony. Irony is the putting side by side an apparent or expected meaning and a deeper or surprising one. Look at how the soldiers actually mock Jesus as the king of the Jews, which in fact he is the king of the Jews. And so you see the irony there. While they are mocking Jesus, they're actually proclaiming the identity, the truth about who Jesus is. Right. So these are the different rhetoric and stylistic features that you want to look out when you read the Gospel of Mark itself. So as you read the Gospel of Mark, do keep in mind these narrative elements that will help you to have a better understanding of the different episodes in the Gospel itself. So what I'm going to talk about next is the methods, right? How do you do narrative criticism? So I'm going to just go very briefly and a kind of bare bone kind of structure to just give us an idea of how a narrative analysis can be done on our reading of the Gospel. So first, of course, you have to analyze the form of the text, right? What kind of text it is? Is it fiction, not fiction, prose, or poetry? Basically, we're asking what is the genre of that writing. right? Is it narrative, parables, allegories, right? So you need to first determine its genre, because the genre determines how we read, how we approach the text itself. Next, as you look at the stories itself, right, try to identify the settings, where it's taking place and when it is taking place. Yeah, so this will be important for us as we read the different gospel stories. Of course, then we have to look at the plot, right? How the story develops, how it begins, how it ends, and where is the climax of the story itself, right? Sometimes there might be gaps in the narratives itself, and it'd be good to help yourself by asking your questions. What is missing? Like, what did the author did not say explicitly in those stories, which the author might, right, expect us to know. Right? So those gaps there, you might want to pay attention to them. Is there anything that's abnormal in the plot itself? Right? Is there a change in theme? Was there a digression or interruption? Was there a repetition? Right? So all these you must pay attention to, and look out for symbols, for motifs, for themes that might be embedded in those stories and in the plot. For example, like desert or Egypt. Right? So these are all symbolic places, and we need to be aware of them as we do a narrative analysis. Then we have to look at the characters, of course. Who are the protagonists and antagonists? What are their motives? Do they change? How do they interact with each other? What did they say? What did they do? This will tell us a lot of things about the characters in the story. Then, of course, you have to look at the perspective. From whose perspective is this story being told? Is it the narrators or is it the characters? Yeah, so this is something that we need to be aware of as well. Right, so this is how we would do a narrative analysis of the Bible stories. So I hope that you at least have a rough idea of how narrative analysis is being done, and read those articles that I've given you and see if it is something they would like to use for your final term paper to do a narrative analysis of the Gospel of Mark. So now we want to go into the text itself, right? As I've said, we're going to look at Mark 2:1 to 3:12. And as you can see here, I have given you a kind of structural outline, and there are actually 5 episodes there. Right, you have the first episode, the healing of the paralytic, then the calling of Levi, questions about fasting, plucking grains on the Sabbath, and healing on the Sabbath. These are 5 episodes which are interrelated. And Mark 3:7 to 12 kinds of give a summary sections to remind us of what we have heard, the ongoing presence of Jesus's disciples and the crowds, Jesus' healing and his mastery of the demons, and his continuing demand for silence when demons correctly name him Son of God. So it kind of give us a summary of the first part, or at least the first 3 chapters of Mark. So let's zero in on Mark 2:1 to 3:6, and as you can see that there are 5 episodes here that continue to show Jesus who he is as we start to get to know him in chapter 1. And of course we see him healing, we see him teaching, eating, calling a follower, accompanied by his disciples, accompanied by crowds. Right? There are a lot of people following him and what he has been doing in these 5 episodes. And we see that in these 5 episodes, right, what we have seen so far is that these are episodes of conflict. It's a conflict between the main characters, Jesus and the Pharisees, and the kind of settings that is being used in these 5 episodes proves to be very interesting. It starts from a house, and then it ended up in another house, in a sense, right? From the house of an ordinary person to the house of God, in a sense, the synagogue itself. Right? So it is kind of from a private house to a kind of public house, from a private setting to a public setting. So you can see how the author of Mark uses the settings to show the kind of conflict or the escalation of conflict in these 5 episodes. So just to give an example of the point of view or perspective, I'm going to use Mark 2, 1 to 12. As you can see here that in the first half, at least up to verse 4 of Mark 2, 1 to 4, that the whole stories are being portrayed or being written from the perspective of the narrators. Then verse 5 onwards is from the perspective of Jesus, the character in the stories itself. So you see that there's a change of perspective, a change of point of view from the narrator to the character in the stories itself. Right. So we also see here that there is a kind of a creative use of the setting in Mark 2, 1 to 12, where you see that it's in a house, there's crowds in the house, the scribes are in the house. So these people are coming to listen to Jesus's teaching. Even the scribes come to listen to Jesus's teaching. But then there's another group of characters, the paralytic and their friends, who are from the outside coming to Jesus, but they are not able to get in. And what do? They force themselves in a sense, by digging through the roof and then lowering the paralytic down from the roof before Jesus. And it's interesting to see this, that the crowds and the scribes are in the house. It's kind of like the idea of insiders. Whereas the paralytic and the friends are coming from the outside, they are kept outside, right? The crowds were all the way to the doors, they got nowhere to go in. It's within the house, they got nowhere to get in, but they force themselves in by digging a hole in the roof and lowering down the paralytic before Jesus. So we do see here the creative use of place or space in the Gospel of Mark, which later on we'll see that those who are in the inside starts to move out and further away from Jesus, right? Whereas those who are at the outside, the paralytic, at the margins of society, begins to move in and move closer to Jesus. We also see echoes in Mark 2, 1 to 12, like the Son of Man, echoing Daniel 7:14. The idea of paralytic as sinful, as unclean, as echoing Leviticus 21:18. And the restoration of the lame, the healing of the lame, echoes the messianic sign in the Old Testament, or the messianic kingdom in the Old Testament, in Isaiah 35:6 and Jeremiah 31:8. And of course, if we look at the grain-field episode in Mark 3, there's also an echo there of the Davidic authority itself. So it's interesting to see how Mark uses these rhetoric devices to show us who Jesus is, that he is the Messiah, the promised one who comes to restore or initiate the Messianic kingdom through what he does and what he taught. Right. So if you look at the literary arrangement, the plot itself, you'll see there is a kind of concentric composition there, where the crowd gathered to listen to Jesus' teaching correspond to the crowd amazed at Jesus' teaching. A prompt. B, Jesus spoke to the paralytic. P, prompt. Jesus spoke to the paralytic. And then C, which is kind of the highlight of the whole encounter, is controversy with the scribes, the questions about authority and about the forgiveness of sin. So as I mentioned earlier, that there seems to be a symbolism of space or movement where the outsider becomes the insider and the insider becomes the outsider in Mark 2, 1 to 12. So if we put all the 5 episodes together, you'll be able to see that these 5 episodes both develops linearly, and there's also a concentric kind of development in these 5 sections. Right? It shows Jesus in gradually mounting conflict with the establishment linearly in the way that it developed. In the first episode, the conflict is kind of muted, indirect. The scribes were merely questioning in their hearts, and by the time we go to the end of the 5th episode, we see that they are plotting to kill Jesus. Right. So you see the escalation of tension within this 5 episode itself. The section also involves a concentric development. Right? The question about fasting forms the central episode and speaks of disciples who, because they are in a company with Jesus, act in ways characteristics of the presence of the kingdom. A presence that explores the boundaries of previous religious traditions. So at the heart of this episode, it speaks also of Jesus's coming death and of the disciples whose life will go on. So this central episode is bracketed by the call Levi and the disciples plucking grain on the Sabbath. 2 episodes that show the disciples enacting kingdom behavior, eating with sinners and acting as David's followers did in the Old Testament. And again, being justified for so doing because they are with Jesus. So these are in turn bracketed by 2 other episodes of healing of the paralytic and the man with a withered hand. Right. So by contrast with inner episodes, neither of these stories directly involves the disciples, and both involve Jesus on a capital charge, right, blaspheming and Sabbath breaking. And it will be on the charge of blasphemy that Jesus will finally be condemned. So acoustically, we sense that what is for disciples the joy of the kingdom in Jesus's presence has at its heart and surrounding the death of Jesus itself. So as we look closer, we'll be able to see the use of settings and plots, how the plots developed. Right. So like for the first episode, the time is undefined. It simply says after some days. Then in the second episode, similarly, the time is not defined. Right? It just says that he went out again beside the sea. So when does it happen? How many days before episode 1 and episode 2? We are not sure. So the time is not defined for us. In the 4th episode, the time is more defined. It tells us that it was on a Sabbath that he was going out through the green fields. Although it's not totally clear which Sabbath and when, but at least we know that it is on a Sabbath, a sacred time for the Jewish people. Similarly, for the last episode, we are told that it was on the Sabbath. So the setting itself, in terms of time, for the last 2 episodes, highlights or rather give us a hint of what might be happening. Right. So on the Sabbath, we have certain kind of expectation for Sabbath, and we are expecting something to happen on the Sabbath itself. When we look at the place, in the first episode, it is at the home, right? At the home of someone. Is a domestic setting. It is in a house. Similarly, for episode 2, it's also in the house. We are told that he reclined at table in Levi's house. Many tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. So it is within the house itself. So as you look at the setting, house, the location of a house, what kind of expectation would you have? Right? And not forgetting that before this, Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law in the house as well. So it's kind of a preparation for us to have certain kind of expectation and understanding when we see that these two episodes is happening in the settings of a house. In the fourth episode, from a domestic setting, it goes into a public setting. So there's a shift in where action takes place from a private house to a public place, the grain fields, where it's open and everyone can see what is going on. There's no protection in that sense of walls. So from an enclosed space to an open space. And then finally, in the last episode, is also in a public place, the synagogue, right, where it is kind of the enemy space. The synagogue, the place, the power base or the powerhouse of the Pharisees and the scribes, where they're actually the leaders there. So you see that it's from a house, a very domestic settings, all the way to a very public, a very religious kind of place, the synagogue itself. So you can see the transition from a house to a synagogue, where Jesus kinds of a more hospitable, passive kind of character, to him entering the synagogue as more active or aggressive kind of movement forward itself. Right. So we also see the characters in these 4 stories. Right, or 5 episodes, that the main characters are actually Jesus and the Pharisees. Right, the other minor characters, the paralytic, the Levite, the disciples, they are there to provide the occasion for the conflict, in a sense. Right, so for the paralytic, it was because of Jesus' healing of the paralytic that there was conflict between the scribes and him. The second episode is because of Levites and the tax collectors and the sinners that created a problem for the Pharisees and Jesus. In the third episode, similarly, is because of fasting. The disciples of John and Pharisees, they fast, but Jesus' disciples do not fast, created that tension there. So it's still a conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees. The fourth and the fifth, similarly, they are the same, where the main characters are Jesus and Pharisees. So we can see here that the whole point that Mark is trying to bring forward to us is to highlight the conflict between Jesus and the authorities. And it's from a very passive to a very aggressive kind of conflict, where they just question their heart in the first episode, all the way to the climax, where they went out with and consulted with the Herodians to destroy Jesus. So you see that kind of escalation there. Right. So because of the question of cleanliness, right, basically who Jesus is he able to forgive sins, right? Eating with the sinners and the tax collectors, to question on Sabbath, right? Still Sabbath authority, Sabbath requirements. So it is actually surrounding questions of authority. What kind of authorities does Jesus has that he can break the Sabbath, right? For the last 2 episodes, to go through the grain fields and to pluck the grain, and even to heal on a Sabbath. And then the first 2 episodes has to do with the kind of authority that Jesus has, the forgiveness of sins, right? Whether it's the paralytic or the tax collectors and the sinners and Levi. So you see that the entire episodes link together into a very nice, compact text on the conflicts between Jesus and the Pharisees. And it is interesting, like what I've said, that this is also not only a linear development, but also concentric development, because if you see in this picture itself, you'll find that the center episode has no place, no time, right? We are not told when it happened, where it happened, but it is a question about fasting. And it's here that Jesus uses the parables of the old and new garment, old and new wine to highlight who he is and what is his purpose here. So while there's a linear development, there's also a concentric arrangement here within the 5 episodes itself, where the parables of the old wine and new wine, the old cloth and the new cloth itself, um, tell us that Jesus came to do something new, that there's no way to rein him in with the old ways of doing things. Right. So this is the concentric uh, arrangement within these 5 episodes. And of course, this is in fact the crux of the issue, right? The conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees. And it kind of hint at the death of Jesus because the old cloth will the new cloth will cause a tear in the old cloth, and the new wine will cause the old wine to burst. So there's kind of a great conflict, that there was a certain kind of destruction, and maybe it hints at the kind of uh, result that comes from the conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees. Right. So we see the conflict develops linearly from Mark 2, 1 to 12 to Mark 3, 1, 6, where it's more passive, questioning their hearts, to where they went out actively and counsel with the Herodians on how they can destroy Jesus. It's kind of like a climax of the conflict in these 5 episodes. So within these 5 episodes, we see the escalation of the tension, and there seems to be no resolution. So where does the resolution comes from? And that's where we'll have to continue to read the Gospel of Mark to see how the whole story is developed from here, and where is the climax, and then where is the resolution of the story itself. So with narrative analysis, looking at these 5 episodes, it gives us a better understanding of what is happening within these 5 stories itself, and help us to have a better grasp and better understanding of the creativity of Mark in putting these stories together, and helping us to see the crux of the issues that's being raised here, and the escalation of the tension that will build up to the climax of the entire Gospel of Mark. So this is Mark 2, 1 to Mark 3, 6. Right. So what are you to do as part of this home-based learning, video-based learning, self-learning kind of work, is that I would like you to take a look at these 5 episodes and choose one of these episodes, right? Any one of them, and do a simple narrative analysis, flowing through the methods that I've shown you. I've roughly gone through, right, and write 100 to 200 word exercise, right, on your analysis, narrative analysis of any one of these 5 episodes, right? So this, together with the previous exercise they asked you to do, identifying the symbolism in the Gospel of Mark, right? So these 2, do them and then submit to me by next Tuesday, right, as part of the requirement for this kind of video learning that will go towards your attendance. Right? So if I don't receive anything from you, your attendance for this session will be 0. Will be considered that you are absent. Okay, so this will be session 3 of our time together on the study of the Gospel of Mark. Right, so just a kind of a summary here. You see conflict between Jesus and authorities. You see the plot, the escalation of conflict, and the movement from inside to outside. We'll see that those at the margins comes closer to Jesus, while those in the center of society or religious institution starts to move out away from Jesus, right? And you see that there's a repetition there of crowd gathering around Jesus from margins to center, right? So you as you do that exercise, I'd like you to also try to pay attention to some of these things which you will be able to see in the different episodes in the Mark Gospel itself. Right, so that's all for this session, and I'll see you again next week, next Wednesday. Okay, so goodbye and have a good week.